Welcome back to my channel Schizophrenia in My Family. Today, I'm going to continue discussing the risks for developing schizophrenia with more of a focus on sensitivity, trauma, and stress as they are all related. With that, let's start. Schizophrenia is strongly tied to the health of our neurological system, or the system of our brain and our nerves. As an example, my sister and I came down with chickenpox in our mid to late teens. Having chickenpox is another known risk factor for developing schizophrenia. In fact, I believe that any illness or bacteria that has the ability to cause you pain, sensory stress, distress, or damage you neurologically has the potential to increase your risk of schizophrenia. It again speaks to the idea of extreme sensitivity that drives the illness. I still remember how itchy it was having chickenpox for me, so much that it felt like pain. I sat there for 4 days dabbing my little chickenpox blisters with calamine lotion to relieve the itchiness. It really was something to endure. I remember seeing my sister shaking from the itching sensation. For her, it had become so bad that my mom had to take her to the hospital room and they had to give her something to relieve her from the extreme itchiness, which for her was like unbearable pain. She was far more sensitive to pain than I was. In middle school, I remember how sensitive my back was and still is to touch. I still can't stand anyone gently touching my back, even if I'm ready for it, because the touch causes me to have a muscle spasm. In a crowded subway, I have to try to stand apart from people to protect my back in the case that they accidentally brush my back. My kids, for a joke, to test my sensitivity, put their hand on my left knee and tickle me since I'm so sensitive to touch. Then, for a test, I tried the same on my mother, and she also couldn't take just a little tickling of the knee. Lastly, for my sister with schizophrenia, I tried the same thing, and at first she also grimaced because it was too ticklish for her to take. I did it again on her, and she screamed angrily at me to stop. So I did. Test concluded. Interestingly, my kids tried the same thing on my right knee, and it was a bit ticklish, but much more tolerable. I asked Mava why she thought that was, and she answered exactly as I was thinking. Daddy, she said, they cut your knee so it's less sensitive, right? And she is right. I have a large scar on the inside of my right knee from a partial meniscus repair surgery. After that surgery, I remember that the front of my knee was very numb as they had cut through a bunch of nerves that were on the front of my knee. Over the years, the feeling has returned, but it is still significantly less sensitive than on my left knee where there was no operation. This physical sensitivity is a terrible weakness to have with children who want to find new and interesting ways to tickle you. I think that the reason that family genetics and environment are strong predictors is that we inherit our physical ability to sense things from our parents and their genetics. This means our sight, hearing, physical sensation, taste, and smell. Our sensory strength or weakness is largely driven by our parents' genes. This is our innate physical sensory ability. Recently, scientists have identified that 15 to 20% of people are classified as highly sensitive individuals in the general population. They think that this group is born this way and show as fussy babies or babies that react more strongly to external stimulation. Research seems to show that this group of highly sensitive individuals makes up about 50% of people who seek help from mental health professionals. I'll put a link to this high sensitive individual's self-test in the description below. I took the test and scored 24 out of 27. If you or your family identify as a highly sensitive individual, then you should pay attention to your self-care and make sure that you don't overload or overstress yourself. Many people who are highly sensitive also may identify as an empath. I personally identify as both. I'll discuss this particularly interesting and relevant topic in a follow-up video as there is so much information. Related to sensitivity, our brains have to process those senses or sensations. The healthier our brains are, means that we have a better ability to process these senses. It also means that the stronger and healthier our brain is, the less likely we are to reach a state of overload. We also inherit a great deal of our mental capacity from our parents, which is essentially our ability to sense and process that sensory information and store it as memories or knowledge. It also explains why we have limitations on what we can process and how much we can tolerate. This also means that we individually can go past our mental and emotional limits and progress over time into illness. I think that this is one of the critical differences between me and my sister. My sister was more sensitive than I was. I think that I have also practiced healthier lifestyle habits to help me deal with my high sensitivity to avoid overload. I had a lower risk profile. We also know that traumas in our lives and our environment also increase our risk. When we're exposed to something, and if that experience is negative or perceived as negative, it can create a trauma that we remember and internalize. This trauma is then registered by our bodies and remembered for the future so that we can identify it again or similar events like it. Unfortunately, this memory creates an elevated cortisol response now and also in the future when we're faced with a similar circumstance. This fight or flight stress response, especially when it is sustained or long lived, is what moves us closer to the illness. When we experience a trauma, our bodies bathe our brains in cortisol, which helps us to retain the memory and gives us the ability to fight or flee. It also reduces our capacity to process things more intelligently in the moment so we can act. So, if this goes on for a long time unabated, it causes us systemic and long-term damage to our brain. If we have an elevated response for too long due to cumulative traumas without relief, or we have too much increased ongoing sensitivity, then we develop the illness. This is a cumulative effect. It's like working too hard for too long and needing a vacation. We get burned out. But with schizophrenia, the vacation from sensation and stress never comes, and people can turn to medication or drugs for relief. Cognitive therapy tries to help us to deal with these past traumas and process them properly. People who experience war can develop mental illness. Often it is the experiences that they see or that they hear or that they can't fully process that makes them more sensitive to similar inputs in the future. We see this in illnesses like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. We also know that people who have persistent pain have decreased brain mass, which also means reduced processing capacity. Decreased brain mass is another feature of people with schizophrenia. I don't think it's a coincidence. Another example that we can look to is that of torture. People who are tortured are repeatedly traumatized by either too much or too little stimulation. It is usually visual, auditory, or physical. Think of things like bright lights, sleep deprivation, loud sounds, waterboarding, or solitary confinement. In this way, they can be made to develop a state of psychosis similar to schizophrenia. It is again driven first by too much or too little stimulation to make them increasingly sensitive, and then they, in effect, have traumatic brain damage leading to illness, even if it is temporary or long-term and long-lasting, like in PTSD. Ethnicity is also a statistical risk factor. Various studies have shown that Black people are diagnosed at 2 to 4 times the rate of white people. The answer is not clear for the scientific community. For me, as a BIPOC person who has developed a significant amount of racial sensitivity due to my life experiences, it again comes down to trauma experienced due to perceived racism. That emotional trauma makes me more sensitive in general, whether or not that perceived racism was actually intended or not. It is how my mind interprets the interactions. My mind and body go through a bout of perceived racial trauma, and then I become more attuned to similar instances in the future. An example of this is being pulled over and ticketed for speeding while not actually speeding, or while being asked for a receipt for something that I purchased while others around me are not. The last and most important risk factor in terms of developing schizophrenia for the first time or relapsing into psychosis is stress. Stress isn't only what you may think it is. Stress can be anything that is an extreme change from what you are used to now or your current situation to something suddenly very different. It can be a life change like going to university, the death of a parent, or the loss of a job. For me, the son on vacation after going through the Canadian winter was a new stress that triggered my sun allergy. A fight with a spouse or too much work for too long can be a stress. A young child whose parents frequently fight in front of them, or if their parents are going through a divorce, can be a very large source of stress, emotional trauma, and potential self-blame. If you go to a loud nightclub for an extended period of time and you have too much sensory overload visually or orally, for you, that is stress. When you have multiple simultaneous stressful overlapping incidents over a sustained period of time, then you have a problem. When your sensitized body and your heightened senses undergo too much sustained stress, then it develops into depression and then maybe eventually psychosis and schizophrenia. I think this increased sensitivity is one of the necessary factors for the start of the illness. This is the primary driver that I believe causes the illness, and it also means that we're all at a lesser or greater risk to some degree depending on the stress in our lives. For most of us, when we get too close to that line, we burn out, and then we take a vacation to recover ourselves. Scientists have also found that people with schizophrenia have a higher than normal level of cortisol in their saliva, again supporting my theory of sensitivity driving stress. Over time, this increased sensitivity due to stress is eventually registered as pain. I believe this is why drug and alcohol use, or things like painkillers or opioids, figures so commonly with mental illness. People in pain simply seek relief. If they cannot achieve that relief with good habits or good addictions, then they seek out that relief with bad habits and bad addictions. I'll always remember when we found large, empty bottles of Tylenol when my sister was getting ill, and even today she uses more pain relief medication than I would consider normal. I've known many people who were overcome with personal stress and pain from emotional or personal issues, or things like chronic but painful medical conditions. They often use alcohol or drugs to escape their pain, and this includes my father. Unfortunately, bad habits that decrease our capacity to deal with sensation will make it easier to enter depression and psychoses. Conversely, good lifestyle habits and choices like a healthy diet, good nutrition, and positive relationships will improve our capacity to handle and manage life stress events and reduce our chances to experience mental illness. We need to fully understand this, and those in our lives need to understand it as well. So the next time when you or your spouse or your child says they need a vacation, we should take them more seriously. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you've learned a lot. I hope that we are more familiar with the risks to developing mental illnesses. We can learn to prevent them in ourselves and our children, especially if they are sensitive. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I also would appreciate it if you can like and subscribe to my channel to encourage me to make more videos, and also let me know if you think I'm on the right track. In the next video, I'll discuss more about the reasons for my theory and how I came up with it. I'll also discuss why I think it is common for people to develop the illness when they go through puberty, which is yet another unanswered question for developing schizophrenia.